My name is Victoria Keddis. I'm a mom of two. I'm a facilitator and manager with FamilySmart. And today I'm honored to be the host of this really important conversation. So, this is for families who are dealing with those really complex dynamics with their kids. We know parenting is hard, but as one of my favorite people say, this is for the, but holy crap, this is really hard. Today, I'm joined by two parents who really get this. So please welcome Tammy and Diane, and I'll let them introduce themselves. Tammy, why don't we start with you?
Hi, my name's Tammy, and I'm a mom to three now young adults. And I've worked as a parent peer support worker for FamilySmart for about 11 years now. Currently, I work at CAPSU at Surrey Hospital, and I also work at Start North team in the Fraser region.
Thank you. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. My name is Diane. I work as the provincial parent peer support worker at the Kelty Mental Health Centre at BC Children's Hospital. And I have two young adult sons now.
Thank you. Thank you, Diane, for being here with us and for coming with your lived experience as parents. We really value that, and we're so grateful for your conversation with us today. For the rest of you joining us, if you are triggered throughout this event at all, please connect with someone you know or reach out for support. We really care about you and your well-being, and you don't have to be alone in this. So when we are having a hard time connecting with our kids, or our kids are struggling with things that we see as behavior, we often turn to many of the resources out there, whether it be books or videos or parenting classes. And we're often told to focus on typical parenting strategies such as reward or punishments or behavior management. And for some kids, that approach just doesn't work. It can even make it harder for them, causing them to react in really bigger ways. When we have kids who are wired a little differently, it's one of those things that they can be more sensitive and maybe more dysregulated. And because of this, they may benefit from a different approach rather than the typical reward punishment parenting style. As parents, it can be hard to know where to go from here. So knowing that, and knowing you have your own lived experience, Tammy and Diane, what do you want parents who may be focusing on their kids' behavior, because that's what we've always been told to do, what do you want them to know? Diane, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So the important thing to understand about behaviors is that they're our child's way of telling us something that they don't yet have the skills to manage. If we only focus on changing the behavior, we're actually missing an opportunity to build a skill, and we're focusing on the wrong problem. So for example, when my child was very young, early elementary school age, we had a really, really hard time getting to school every day. Every morning was very intense. We had epic meltdowns, etc. And I tried everything there was that I knew how to do to force him to get to school. We had behavior plans set up with his teacher. I tried bribery, physically carrying him in, consequences, the whole thing. But as we know, forcing a child to do something that they can't do doesn't work in the long run. I was focusing on the wrong problem. And for me, it took getting curious, letting go of the outcome of getting to school and connecting with him in a different way, validating how he was feeling so that he felt seen and heard. And after some time of rebuilding our connection together, we were able to figure out that the problem wasn't really school at all. The problem was how the school day was starting. It was way too loud for him, too chaotic. There wasn't enough structure. Other kids were too close to him. So once we had that information, we were able to make a different plan that worked much better for him. And honestly, I would say that was my first experience of really understanding the importance of connecting with my son where he was at and how important it was to validate how he was feeling in those distressing times. I needed to learn to see my child for who he is and where he's at, rather than that little person that you just take from place to place to do all those things that typical kids do. So for us, the whole key is seeing that our children are an individual. They're a little person, and we need to be curious about their behavior and connect with them first so we can validate how hard this is for them. And then we can start problem solving with them.
Mm-hmm.
I love that idea of curious first about the behavior and then connecting. Tammy, what does this? What do you want families to know when we think about this as our focus?
Well, I think it's really hard. First of all, it's really, really hard because when I was first trying to look for a different approach, it was really hard to find anything that made sense to me because I was focused on the behavior, as you know, and what I just want to kind of say is if the behavior strategies and the management strategies that we're trying, those typical parenting strategies aren't working, if they're working, then we've got a typically wired child and we carry on. You're not watching this webinar likely if that's your situation. So when that is not us, and it's not the child's fault. It's really trying to get, like Diane said, curious about what that behavior might mean so that we are actually trying to help solve problems that might be making the behavior worse instead of just trying to manage the behavior. And I think this is something that I know I recognize now looking back. I spent a lot of energy, a lot of time trying to manage behavior, and it got progressively worse as my child got older because I was solving the wrong problem. I was missing the point. And I know that for a lot of parents that we connect with that have children that are wired differently, this is also their experience. So kind of what do we do with that? I think, first of all, just recognizing if we're feeling overwhelmed, we're burning off our energy and we're not being effective, that could be an indicator. Let's look at it in a different way. So I know that when that starts to happen, we also build a lot of resentment. I did. I felt frustrated. I started to feel really resentful, like I'm trying super hard here and it's not working. It's not helpful. It's not changing anything. And also I recognized that my child was also feeling that. He was feeling frustrated. I just don't get it. That's what he'd say to me. You just don't get it. You don't understand. And so there was this miscommunication as I was trying to support him. So I think that's a common thread that when we have kids that need to get looked at under a different light, we need to look at what that behavior actually is meaning to them and getting curious. And we want them to turn to us for support, but they're less likely to if we've got all of those things, those frustrations and things getting in the way. So I think what I learned and what I'd like to share with everyone else is actually how do we influence things to go better by letting go of trying to control behaviors, which to me made a lot of sense. It was really hard to kind of wrap my head around the how to do that. And I'm just going to share my screen because I have this slide that I just found really helpful to think about. So when I kind of let go of the things that aren't in my control, if my child's behavior isn't in my control, and I really focus on the parts of that are in my control, and I'll talk about that in a second, that's when I can actually influence things to go better. So if I'm letting go of the things that aren't in my control, it's more about letting go of control and focusing on those areas where I can start to build my influence. And I think this idea of letting go and honing in so that we build influence is powerful, but not easy. And there's a couple of things that I think get in the way. So I just want to kind of break it down a little bit and really be specific about some of the things that are in my control as a parent. So my words, what I say it, how I communicate with my child is completely in my control. I can learn new skills about communication, perhaps, learn new tips around how do I validate my child's experience as a way of building connection. All of those things are in my control. I can learn new ways of communicating if that's getting in the way. But what I say and how I say it, totally in my control. What I do, my actions, more importantly, how I respond. So I recognize now looking back, when things weren't going well, I most of the time was reacting in the moment. I was so frustrated, and here we are again in the same whatever that looked like. Things weren't going well and I was trying so hard, and then I'd just be reactive in the moment. I'd be frustrated. And so by just thinking about it in advance and deciding how I'm going to respond, if this happens, this is going to be my response, really thinking it out and sort of having a plan, that actually gave me a really good sense of control. I was less likely to go into that reactive moment, and it went better. So that's in my control, how I respond, what I do. And then, of course, we can't talk about this without a conversation about boundaries. They're so important to healthy relationships. And I think for myself, and I know this is another common thread for many other parents, boundaries are really tricky when our kids are really struggling. It can feel very very hard to even understand what is a boundary and what is a rule and all of those things. We're going to talk about that today too. But that is something that's in my control. What's okay and what's not okay for me, that's in my control. I can decide how I'm going to message that, what I'm going to do to enforce that boundary. That's in my control. And it's different than a rule or a limit. We're going to talk about that, as I've said, in a little bit. So I think those three areas are what we want to focus on. What we can say, what we can do, thinking about our own boundaries. And then, of course, on the other side of this screen are the things that I recognize now are completely not in my control. And these are the things that I really, really want to control, because they're usually the things that scare the crap out of me as a parent. My child's decisions, whether or not they're going to take medication, for example, or engage with services if they've got a mental health challenge or even a physical health challenge, and there's some treatment plan there, and they decide they don't want to engage with that, I'm pretty limited. That's my child's choice. That their decision is not something that I can control. That doesn't mean I don't have influence on it, but I can't control it. So it's intentionally recognizing where that control is. My child's actions, and this can be, again, another really scary thing. For example, if they're using substances or they're engaging in self-harming behaviors, those things can be really scary as a parent. And really, we want to kind of control that, but it's really in my child's control. Their actions are in their control. And then the last one, I think this was the most challenging for me, my child's thoughts and moods. And this can be especially hard if our child is experiencing things like major depression or huge anxiety, like off the charts anxiety, or having overwhelming thoughts of suicide. Those are terrifying as a parent. We want that to stop. We want that to go better. We want it to shift. And this is really about recognizing that that's actually not in my control. So thinking about it in a different way, how do we influence it? By looking at the things that are in our control.
This stuff is hard too.
Oh,
I think we could say this over and over and over, but this is hard stuff as parents. And it's so contrary to the message we get from the majority of people who are telling us, oh, you just need to do this. How have you tried this? But when you have kids like our kids, it doesn't work.
But it's not effective. It's not effective.
Yeah, it's not effective. Exactly. Yeah. So
we won't.
Yeah, this is impossible feeling stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure. There's some evidence though that like this isn't just sort of an idea, and we're just talking about our own particular experience, although we are talking about our own experience because we've actually tried typical parenting, had it be disastrously unhelpful, and then figuring out ways to start to build a different way of responding to our kids. And it's also taking in information from different areas. So I'm going to just reference Scott Miller, and you'll be sent, anyone who's participating, you'll be sent out a resource sheet after this session with some of the things that we're going to reference here. And Scott Miller's website is one of them, but he's done some research on practice, like what makes a good counselor, what makes a good clinical support for young people who are struggling with their mental health. And actually what he's discovered is the modality of treatment is less important than the quality of the relationship with the practitioner. And it's not just about talking and being a friend to a young person who's struggling. It's not just that. It is about that level of support, really seeing the person first, the struggles as a person having struggles, not a behavioral challenge that needs to be shifted, and being able to build a really strong relationship that's supportive. And so we know that clinically, that's one of the indicators of good, solid intervention is the quality of that relationship building lens. There's some specific ways that he talks about how that should look, like feedback informed practice and all sorts of other things. But as parents, that's a really important piece of information, because as a mom, I'm here for the long haul. I'm going to be somehow connected to my child as long as I have breath in my body, whether they live with me, whether they live apart from me, whether they're, in my house, still a minor, whether they're grown and they have a family of their own. That connection is lifelong for us as caregivers. But it's
built in. We have it in a way that nobody else does, right?
Yeah, it's our superpower.
Exactly. Exactly. Those
Um,
caring, connected relationships, when people talk about that, as a parent, we have one that no one else can have.
yeah,
And thank goodness
absolutely.
evidence tells us that that means more than all the other stuff that's out there sometimes. So I'm really grateful for your acknowledgement of that reminder, to see our kids for the person they are and not the problems they create. And when I think about all the things that are really hard as parents and the things that I struggled with and took all those parenting classes for, were the things that I truly had no control over. So all that energy I was spending, all that time I was spending was on things that weren't going to make a difference in how my child was going to be able to show up. So I want to acknowledge families, though, that some of the concepts we're talking about might sound quite radical and a radical way of thinking of this as for parents. But I also want to acknowledge that if you've been doing the traditional, typical all this time, be really gentle with yourself because you didn't know there could be another way or that it might be making things harder for your child. So much compassion for all of us as parents when things have been really hard. So this perspective is a shift to looking at the child or the young person as a person instead of fixating on what we want to be able to change about them. And as both of you have shared, this is hard. And as a parent, when we focus on the need to set rules and expectations because that's what we've been told to do, but we know we can't control what they do. So where do we go from here? Where do we begin to shift our perspective so we can look at what we can do?
So this is where we can jump into talking about boundaries. First of all, I think it's important that we understand what a boundary is and that boundaries are different than rules. So a rule is something that we set for someone else, and really we don't have any control over it, where a boundary is something we set for ourselves and we do have control over. Brene Brown gives a great definition of boundaries, and we're going to actually include a video clip in the resource sheet that you'll get later on. And she talks about boundaries quite a lot. And she defines a boundary simply as what is okay and what is not okay for me. A boundary can't be negotiated. If it's not okay with me, it's not okay with me. Whereas a rule, there's always room for negotiation. I'm sure that we all have been in a situation of setting a rule for our child who immediately comes back with, okay, but what about, and there's a million exceptions, but a boundary is different than that. It's just us saying, that's not okay for me. Setting boundaries are going to help us say yes when we want to say yes and no when we want to say no. That was a big lesson for me because I don't think I really understood how boundaries worked for a long time. And to learn the difference between rules and boundaries was key in successfully changing some things in our home. So how do we know when to set a boundary? When we're finding ourselves consistently frustrated or maybe feeling resentful, angry, you're being taken advantage of. And again, when it comes back to that time when you find yourself always saying yes, but what you want to be saying is no, that can be a good place to stop and think, what's going on here? And is this a place that would be beneficial to have a boundary? How do we enforce those boundaries though? So it's an important piece of enforcing boundaries is have conversations about boundaries when things are calm. Be clear about what your boundary is, name it, share it with your child so that when a situation is escalated, you're able to remind them, this is a boundary for me, and then you don't need to explain it any further. If they continue to cross that boundary, there needs to be an action attached to it. So it might be something like, if this boundary is crossed, I'm going to leave the room or I'm going to walk away. Again, it's something I have control over. It's a boundary I've set for myself, so I can control how I respond to it. If your child continues to engage in crossing the boundary, obviously you need to have a decision in place as to what you're going to do to maintain that. But that's going to look different in every family. So for example, in my family, I have a boundary around my child swearing at me. My child and I tend to communicate through text message. So for us, it looks like if texting language is escalating, I remind my child, it's not okay to swear at me. If the swearing continues, I say the boundary one more time. It's not okay to swear at me. If you continue, I'm going to turn my phone off. So as it just kind of sharing a similar boundary, but how it looks differently. I know Tammy has a similar boundary around swearing. And how does it look in your house, Tammy, when your boundary gets crossed.
Yeah, this was a big learning for me also. I think it's going to be a lifelong journey for me, just unpeeling all of the things that boundaries are a part of in different aspects of my life. But for this one, I recognize that my child, when he started to get escalated, swearing was one of the first indicators, and it rapidly escalated from that point. And I'm not a sweary person, I'm just not. And that was a big trigger for me. It just was not okay. It would build up instantly. I would get prickly, like, how dare you swear at me? I'm trying so hard to help you. And like, it was just that sense of indignity and like, it's so not okay. And he should know that, right? You should know you shouldn't swear at your mom. So that was my inner voice. And I love watching
So
Brene
true.
Brown talk about boundaries, because she kind of addresses that. And I'm like, oh, actually, if I say, this is a boundary for me and this is not okay, like sometimes you need to tell people your boundaries. You can't expect them to know, even though I thought anyone
It's
should
common
know that.
sense,
It's
right?
common sense.
Hello.
You've talked to 5 people on the road and they'll say, yeah,
Yeah.
it's not okay to swear at your mom.
Naming it, it's important.
Naming it is important. So for me, it was really, what is it that really like gets me that instant, like, oh, this is so not okay. And for me, it was as soon as the swearing started, and sometimes it would be directed at me, but oftentimes it was just in general, swearing at the world, swearing at the situation. So it was like, okay, this is a boundary for me. I had to first figure it out for myself. This is not okay. And now I need to let my child know, because just assuming he knows that's what I was doing all along, and feeling resentful. So I just I'd said it beforehand, like, hey, I know when you get upset, swearing comes out of your mouth, and I'm letting you know it is not okay. That is not going to be okay. And if that happens, I'm going to let you know and tell you it's not okay. And if you continue, I'm not going to have any more conversation. I'm going to walk away. So I needed to like let him know up front, because it was a change.
Yeah.
We were going to start enforcing this. And so that's what it ended up being. And for me, it was remarkably simple. I thought of all the different ways that he's just going to blow through it, because he had in the past, and it's just not going to work. And then I get into the explaining the boundary, like, it's not okay to swear at your mom. I'm trying really hard. And, we'd get into this argument, like we're negotiating my boundary. And I felt like if I just convinced him it was an important one, that he would understand and he'd stop. And it was like, no, just let him know. And I used a visual as well, because I know that my child gets dysregulated quickly, and often he doesn't hear language in the same way. So I might say something and he really doesn't hear it very well. So I needed a visual. So when it would start, I just say, stop, you're swearing, that's not okay. Just like it's Tuesday. I didn't escalate my voice. I just gave him the information. It was so helpful to have that process, because the first few times he pushed up against it. And then I had my step 2, which was, I've told you and you're continuing, it's not okay. And I'd leave. I'd just leave the room and not engage. And it took a few times to really set that in place before it started to take effect. So I think that's another thing to think about, is when you're starting to enforce and recognize that there's a boundary you might need to set, or a limit, and you're doing it, to expect them to challenge it.
Absolutely.
And be
Would they
prepared.
be our kids if they didn't?
Yeah. And I remember talking with someone who was really skilled and saying, like, I'm trying so hard, but he just doesn't listen to me. And so it was like, oh, okay. So then what is your strategy, that if the boundary gets pushed, what are you going to do that's in your control? Because I'd say, well, I tell him to go for a walk and cool off, but he won't listen to me. He won't do it. I'm like, well, I can't force him to go out the door and go for a walk, but I can go out the door and go for a walk.
Yeah.
Oh, that's in my control, right?
Yeah.
So it was really looking at all of those places where I would get stuck on how to enforce boundaries, but it was very effective over time. It took a while to get it solid under me, to get the messaging, to not get into, you shouldn't be arguing about
Well, and
it.
it takes a while for us and them, right?
Yes. We're
Certainly
changing the dance.
Yes, you're changing everything. And yeah, as a parent too, it takes multiple, there's still times. Yeah, there's still times now.
You've given us this really good foundation of what a boundary is and how to do it and what it could look like. I love the examples you gave us. And I think the part of that is that I can imagine all the parents who are at home going, well, I have this boundary and this boundary, and I'm going to set up this boundary. It can be overwhelming. So I think about how if we're shifting our perspective to kind of look at that idea of rules and expectations and changing our way of what can we control, and boundaries is something we can control. Rules are something we negotiate, and we can't make someone do those things. So the boundary piece, where can families start? Let's start with you, Tammy. Where can they start to begin this process, knowing that there's probably a list of 50 things they'd like to go off and set a boundary around as they.
And yeah, and that's exactly true. And that was my first,
So
like,
true.
oh, this is something that I could actually have control over and do. And then I had a whole list of things that I wanted to set boundaries around. This. And it was really helpful when, again, I was working with a really skilled practitioner who was supporting me in understanding what I could do and what I couldn't do and all of this. So it was really helpful to talk it out with someone and hone it down. What's the number one thing? What is the number one thing that I feel is an important boundary? That's the one thing I'm going to focus on. So it was really starting with one thing, not everything, because it was too overwhelming. So the one thing that I started with was the swearing, because that seemed like it came up often enough that I could practice setting that boundary and walking away from it. And it kind of was at the base of a lot of other things that followed. So it was a really good place for me to start. And I think that was really helpful information to start with one thing. And even to recognize that even if we're only shifting one thing, one small shift over time, we end up in a different place. It's like that moving forward. If we're only moving one small step in the direction we want to go, over time, we end up in a different location, right? We end up somewhere different. So that was helpful to just focus on that. And also just recognizing that there's stages that we all go through of change, where I think my child wasn't even at a point where he saw the problematic stuff that was going on. He was just so overwhelmed by everything that was happening. He didn't see that anything could change or that he needed to change anything. He wasn't even looking at that. He was didn't have the capacity to even see that. And as a parent, I was in like, everything needs to change. You need to be over here in order to have a healthy life and move forward. And so just recognizing that we were on different parts of our journey together was helpful. It was helpful for me to go, okay, it makes sense that I want him to move quickly, but I can only focus on one small step at a time, because he's not even seeing he needs to turn this direction. And I'm saying you need to be over here. So we had to just focus on one small shift and work on that. And as we got that under our belt, then we could add another thing. And it sort of started to come together. But I think that was the really important thing for me. Then the learning for me was small, one thing at a time, and consistency. Once you have a pathway that you're going to do that's in your control, to do step and keep going. Just and like having someone to talk to. It is like building a new habit. It totally is building a new habit.
Yeah.
And we get triggered. So the other thing is be kind, right? Be kind to ourselves, because when we're triggered by whatever and we get overwhelmed by stress, we can't do the same great practice that we're working on. And so, we have to kind of forgive ourselves as we stumble through, and occasionally we fall backwards and we do something and we go, oh, I was trying something new and here I am back doing the same old. Okay. Kind of move forward again. This is really hard. It seems simple. Like I remember thinking, oh, this is pretty simple. I could do this. I'm a pretty smart person. I've got my script. I know what I'm going to say. And then I'd be triggered and like kind of revert back into the typical parenting stuff we're all familiar with, the reward and punishment, like, that's it, you're grounded, that's it, you're losing your things, like that kind of thing would come out of my mouth still, even though I knew that that wasn't effective. So I think it's also important to be kind to ourselves and know that we're impacted by our own childhood, how we were parented. That all has an impact on how we see behavior, what we think about, like how our child should be behaving towards us. It's all so sometimes just getting curious, if we're finding we're constantly being annoyed or triggered by certain things, sometimes that was helpful for me. Oh, sorry, my dog barked and made me jump. Talk about triggers. But just being curious about, oh, what could that be about? And knowing that we all have our own history and our own personal experience, both as children, how we were parented, I know there was some things that I intentionally wanted to do different than how I was parented. And then I would find myself reverting back to things that were familiar. It's like that thing where you say, oh, I'm never going to say that to my kids. And then it comes out of your mouth and you go, that was my
What
mom's
just
voice. Where
happened?
did that come from? It's because we
Yeah.
kind of, when we're stressed, we have to forgive ourselves for not showing up in the same way. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for
Mhm.
that, Tammy. The one thing that really stands out for me is that we spend a lot of time as parents trying different ways to get our kids to do the things we want them to do. And in all of that, when things are really hard with our kids, as you've expressed, and I think of those hard times as a parent, it might feel like the last thing that we can do is connect with them because we're so focused on the behaviors that we're trying to get. And in that, things kind of break sometimes. Our relationship with them isn't as strong when we're doing those typical parenting styles because our kids are reacting bigger. They aren't doing what we want them to do. They're not listening. All of those pieces that parents get frustrated by and that our kids get frustrated by. And then there comes this gap between us where we just don't have fun together anymore. We don't play, we don't communicate, we don't talk the way we used to or we'd like them to. And so knowing that we've got these other things to draw from, looking at our boundaries and what we can control and what we can influence, what about some strategies or skills that parents can use to help build that connection that might have been broken or damaged during times when we weren't able to be all the things we wished we could be for our kids?
I know for me that it was a big jump as a parent to figure out I needed to see my child as a person. My two sons are very, very different. And my oldest son is very, very similar to me. And my youngest son, I feel like we have nothing in common whatsoever. And he's the one that was the most challenging for sure. And I don't even remember what the situation was that triggered it off, but just to take a step back and look at him as an actual person and not just my child made a huge difference in how I viewed him. As well as sort of like looking at the situation. If he's this little person with all of his own feelings and thoughts and skills, he's interacting with situations very differently than I would have, or my other son would have. So being able to see him for who he is was key for us. And then meeting him where he's at. That was a big one for me. And I mean, my son's 24 now. I still have times where I have to step back and remind myself, he's not me. He's not my other son. And it still feels foreign. It really does, because we're so different. It still can feel odd to look at him and think, wow.
I think it's really easy to when things haven't been going well, when it's really, really hard, like really hard, that we tend to just focus on all the problems. I know I did. It was really hard to think about all the strengths that my child also has, because they were so overshadowed by all of the problematic things that were getting in the way. It was like that took over our whole focus. That was my whole focus. It was, I kind of had blinders on to see really any strengths at all. And that wasn't seeing him for who he is as a person and those incredible strengths and gifts he has. And so it's really, that was something that I found really helpful, was to start to focus on those areas of strengths, not ignoring the challenges, because of course they were big and they were always there. But when we were trying to kind of rebuild a connection, and when the relationship felt really broken and really stretched, like I didn't know if we'd ever be able to get to a place where we could even have a conversation together without it going sideways. There was times where he wouldn't even have conversations with me, period, like flat out, doesn't matter. I am not talking to you. I'm not having anything to do with you. It was really, really challenging. And so focusing on the areas of strength for me, I know that helped me see him with different eyes. When I think about how do we connect with people, we connect through our eyes, right? Through our facial expression. So our kids are really attuned to us. And when we have really sensitive kids, they can be even more attuned. So they may misread our neutral face as more negative just because they're so sensitive. They're so
I'd say that's pretty common.
Yeah, I think that is pretty common
with kids like ours. Yeah.
Yeah. And so even that sensitivity, I noticed that my child would sometimes react, think I was upset with him when I actually wasn't. I was literally like making the grocery list in my head, and it was just a neutral face, but he always had that kind of negative lens. And the way I approached it that I know was not effective was like, you're thinking wrong. I'm not mad. What's the matter with you? Like, no, I'm, trying to give him the correct information so that he wouldn't be impacted by that, because you can't go through life thinking people are upset with you when they're actually just making their grocery list. That's not okay. And what was really more helpful was, again, to look at it from that understanding that he's more sensitive to facial expression. And what could I do about that? Like, I can soften my look when he's in the room. I can see him for the strengths that he has, because then I'm looking at him with different eyes. It's all in the eyes, right? We project a lot. Whether we're feeling stressed about the situation, they pick it up, even if we're not conveying that, even if we're trying to kind of validate by what we're saying. So I think it has to align. We have to be able to have that compassion for our kids in order to start to rebuild and support that connection.
It
And
took me a long time to get there though, Tammy.
Oh, totally. Me
Find
too.
that too. I feel like
Yeah.
as parents with sensitive kids with big emotions and big reactions, for me, it was super easy to get lost in the situation.
Yeah.
And forget that there was a person there.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that metaphor of a storm and being swept up in it really, really spoke to me and helped me to kind of view it as that, because it very much swept me up into like, oh my gosh, this is not okay. This needs to change. I need to, you can't be going through life like this, and focusing again on that dysfunction or whatever wasn't going well, rather than saying, okay, this is happening. It's not turning blinders to that. It's not saying, well, it's not in my control. Can't do anything. I give up. It's not that. It is recognizing what we're seeing and then either being curious or supporting our child in a different way, validating for them. Yes, I see how hard this is for you. It totally makes sense to me. It doesn't mean we agree with what they might be doing, the behaviors, but we can also help them to see that what they're thinking and feeling is actually something that's unique to them. And it makes sense given their sensitivity, given their circumstance, given their history. It makes sense. And I'm here to support you. We can help them to feel that support intentionally. Of course, we're here to support our kids. But when we have sensitive kids, they sometimes view our stress about the situation, our fear that something bad will happen, and we feel so out of control. They pick up on that and they feel judged and shamed. And of course, that gets in the way of feeling connected, because if I look at you and you're really important to me, but I get a sense that you feel judgment for me, or I feel ashamed of my behavior that I feel I can't control. And I look at you and I see that, I don't want to spend time with you because I don't feel like you get me. And I'm, it kind of perpetuates that tension between the relationship. So it's really recognizing, but looking at it with different eyes. Like, yeah, I see my child is having a struggle. It's a big shift from my child is a struggle. And it's how we look at them. That's the only way I can describe it, is they see it in our eyes, whether we have compassion. And again, it's not the extreme end of, oh, I feel so sorry for you. This is so hard. You can't do it. It's not that. No. It is, I see you. I see it's hard for you. I know that you can get through this, and I'm here to support you. It's a different message.
Well, I think that's where we talk about meeting our kids where they are, right? Yeah. Meeting where they're at and learning to connect with them without any other agenda. I'm just here to spend time with you. It's not to get you to go to school or get you to come out of your room or get you to stop doing this thing. It's just straightforward connecting, because we need to be able to connect with them before we have any hope of redirecting them. Right. So sometimes,
you know what comes to mind as you're talking, Diane? This whole thing, and I don't know where it came from. It was some kind of parenting thing that I took years and years and years ago, and it was teachable moments. Look for those teachable moments where you can encourage your child to do what you want them to do, what they need to do, what's important to do. And I think that's what I got stuck in, because as soon as we started to, like, I would try to just build a connection. Hey, let's just hang out and watch a movie, and I'll make some popcorn. Hey, like, do you want to go for a drive and get like a fancy hot chocolate at Starbucks, something like that? And then just hang out, no agenda, just how what's on your mind or what's going on for you that day, or nothing at all. Just let's have hot chocolate. And I got that. But then as soon as it started to feel like
To go well,
the wall
you were
was
like,
breaking down and we were starting
Yeah.
to like, oh, wow, this feels like, this is a teachable moment. Zoom, I got to get in the information that you need
Yeah.
because now you're going to listen to me because you see that I'm trying to help you. And I think that was really something I struggled with for a long time.
Yeah.
Was
I
seeing
can
those.
still struggle with that.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
Because there are teachable moments, but not, I think for the purposes of when we're trying to rebuild a connection, it's focusing on the connection and letting go of any potential outcome. It's like, there's no hidden agenda.
Absolutely.
I have no agenda other than hanging out and watching a movie and let's have a few laughs, or let's, watch an action thriller and have some popcorn. That's it. That's all I want to do. For as long as you want to do it with me.
And that builds the trust back.
It does.
It's so important. So important. When we can validate how our kids are feeling and start to build that little bridge back, it's so powerful down the road when, as we go back to what we talked about in the beginning, we want to expand that circle of influence. This is how you get there, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I'd rather have my child feel confident that they can ask me a question and know that I'm just going to have a thoughtful response rather than telling them what they need to do to fix the problem. I know how to fix the problem.
Well,
I can look at any problem and go, if I've got a leak and under my sink, I'm going to call a plumber because they can fix the problem. That's pretty straightforward. But when we're talking about supporting our kids through difficult emotions or helping them to get a sense of mastery over maybe overwhelming things that are going on in their life, we can't fix it. What they really need and what we all need from each other is to have a supportive, connected, caring relationship with someone who we can talk to about it, who doesn't right away move to fixing it, but just processes with us, because we actually hear our own answers. We know what the solution is, even if we don't think we do, but we need space to talk it out with someone who says, oh yeah, that's really hard. It makes sense why you're struggling with this.
And that's building a skill.
That's building a skill.
Right? It comes right back to where we started in the beginning. We're seeing that behavior and we're missing an opportunity to build a skill.
Yeah.
And this is that.
Yeah. And it's all about recognizing when we're moving into trying to control it.
Yeah.
And saying, this is actually not anything in my control. So I'm intentionally not. I'm just going to, here I go again. I still find myself being moved to try and control something or try and fix it because I just like, this is a problem. And then I have to like consciously go, whose problem is this? I don't need, I can support it. I can offer, I can say, hey, if you're struggling and you want me to, talk it out, I can just listen. Or do you want me to give you some ideas? I can offer that and then step back because it's actually not in my control. And of course, this is different. How we language this and how we talk about it is going to look different for each child. Like you're not going to have the same language around this with a 10-year-old as you are with an 18-year-old.
No.
Because no matter what they're struggling with, we also have to take into account that developmental stage they're at, where they might be younger and they need a little bit more support, more offerings, and as they get older and they're transitioning into those adult things, we want to step back and really be intentional about letting some of those things go. Yeah, it's really difficult, but not impossible.
Thank you. You've given us so many skills to consider. I'm so guilty of the teachable moments. That was, I think, my mantra when the kids were little. It's like, okay, got to get them when they're young and teach them all these things. You talked about focusing on strengths, seeing them as a unique person, validating, connecting before redirecting, meet them where they're at, having compassion for them, not about giving up on them, but supporting them. And that reminder that they're not having a hard time. I mean, they're not giving us a hard time, that they're having a hard time. And to spend time with them where there's no agenda. I think that's really powerful. And to not fix and work with them as a process, and having you, Diane, speak to that, as that's helping build a skill. And Tammy, I think of you calling the plumber. You would have been able to fix it because you are.
Well, I probably could have tried to fix it. Yeah. But if I couldn't, I'd know who to call.
So we look at those skills with the kids that are in our families. I just want to take a quick moment to address, what about those kids that aren't living with us, who may not be in any kind of communication with us? How do we even start to build connection with them? So if we can briefly speak to that as a side of, I mean, sometimes it's truly not just feeling impossible, but right now we're not even together, so that we can work with these skills.
Mhm. Yeah, I think taking the lead, like as parents, we can take the lead on the relationship, even if it's only one way. We can intentionally throw those threads of connection out there, even if our child is not picking them up. So just continually keeping the door to the communication open. I think that's really important, especially if our child is not living with us, if things are feel so broken that the connection feels completely like it's just not there. So it's really thinking about how intentionally and maybe once a week or once every few days or once a day, throwing out that line of connection, even if it's just a text that we think they read and we don't know for sure. It's just, hey, thinking about you. I care about you, period. Just sending out that intentionality about how much we do care and that we're there for them, without that agenda. It's not about getting them to do something.
I think that's the key piece too, especially in situations like that, is the no agenda part. My only agenda is to spend time with my child, to connect with my child, to build a relationship back in whatever that looks like. And we have the ability to initiate that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think sometimes we get back a backlash where I know that, we send out this lovely, I care about you, and we get this nasty, no, you don't, blah, blah, it's your fault, and all of those things. I think it's really important also to not take those things personally, to recognize that this is someone experiencing a great deal of distress, and that anger outward is an expression of their distress, and really looking at it with, I'm not going to take it personally. I know that they're struggling. Because that can be really hard too when we're trying and it's not being received well.
Thank you, Tammy. And yes, never easy. And so I appreciate you taking a moment to address the super, super hard stuff that some of us are facing. We've shared so much in this short amount of time, and I'm just wondering if there's any final thoughts that you would like to make sure you share with families before we wrap up our time today.
I just want to echo what Tammy just said, that taking the behavior personally, that was a huge thing for me, and letting go of that. That was massive. This is hard stuff that we're doing. We're not parenting your typical how to parent guidebook kids. We're just not. And this is hard stuff that's overwhelming a lot of the time. And if you can let go of feeling like you're personally being attacked, it goes a long way. Just a funny little story that my partner has 2 young adult children as well. And one of them was unhappy with him, and he was responding in a way that was quite foreign to me. And all of a sudden I realized, hey, you haven't had a kid be mad at you like this before. I'm like, oh, this is normal. This is nothing. It's okay. And it was so interesting to see such a stark contrast for someone who has typical kids that have grown up typically, been parented typically, and how crushing that was to him to have his child upset with me. And I live in this world. This is our normal. So if you can let go of that stuff and not carry it with you, it is a huge, huge help in the longevity of your relationship with your child.
Yeah. I think as you were talking, Diane, I just that we're parenting in the deep end. This is like, or extreme parenting. You've heard of people that are back, they go for a jog every now and then, they go for a walk, and they're fairly active, and then you have those high performance athletes that really have to watch their diet and their pace, and they've got to do all of these things and trainings to keep in shape to maintain that. And I think of when we've got kids that are wired up differently, that are not typical, that this is parenting in the extreme end. This is parenting in the deep end. So it can feel really hard when we're, if we use that analogy of a pool, right? We're in the deep end, our child's on our shoulders. We're trying to keep both of our heads above water, and we're exhausted, and our child's kind of thrashing and not, it's hard. And then we look over and we see all the moms and dads with their kids in the shallow end splashing and having a lovely time. And we're like, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with this? Like, It's
Yeah.
that we're in a different space and we need
Yeah.
different skills. We need skills that are more effective for our kids.
Mhm.
And just one thing that I don't think we've talked about, and I think it was a really important learning for me. I don't know if this will be helpful for anyone else, but when I see a problem, when I see something that needs addressing and I'm worried, I start talking more. I just, I give ideas and say, I'm trying to be helpful. And I recognized I was doing that and I needed to stop, but it was so hard to shift that. When I recognized I was just going to validate what I was seeing and say, yes, I know this is hard and I'm here if you need me, and kind of back off, that was super hard for me to do. And so as a way of kind of not talking, I started making tea. And I'm a coffee drinker. I was not a tea drinker, but tea is this whole process. You kind of find your favorite mug and you have a few different flavors and you kind of pick a nice flavor. Maybe you add a little honey and you boil the kettle, and it's a process. It was helpful for me because it gave me something to do when I was in that space of really wanting to, like, oh my gosh, it's not going well, I need to do something, but recognizing that's not in my control and I can't, in that uncomfortable place. It gave me something to do. So I'd make tea. And then I learned to say to my child, hey, I'm making tea if you'd like a cup. And then I'd make tea for both of us. And sometimes it would just sit there and that was okay. And then sometimes he'd come and drink tea. And then my second challenge was the tea was helpful to do something with my mouth that wasn't talking, because it was like teachable moment. Oh, yay. Okay, we're here. Now we can find out what the issue is and I can help him solve the problem, whatever's going on. It was like, no, now you need to be quiet. So sipping tea. And it was something that it was a strategy that was helpful for me. So I just encourage, if any of this has resonated with you, of how difficult it is to shift from typical parenting strategies, recognizing they're not effective, to what else could we do, that when we're in the shift, we really need to take care of ourselves because it's so hard. And even to be able to connect with other people who also may be experiencing this different way of parenting, so that we can get ideas from other people to try. It's hard, not impossible, and it's so, so worth it. Our kids can really do incredible growth, because these are the kids that are the movers and shakers of the planet. These are the outside the box thinkers. These are the kids with huge gifts and strengths. They see things in a different way. They're impacted differently. And that's what we can support them. We can support them to get through the hard things so that they can lean into those gifts.
I just want to add to that too, Tammy. Just, I don't think we've said it enough. We need to be kind to ourselves.
So kind to ourselves. This is really hard and it's difficult to.
Yeah. Thank you.
Have some grace for ourselves.
We actually can't have true compassion for our kids' struggle if we don't have true compassion for ourselves.
So true.
How true. And on that, I think about your comment on the extreme athlete and if there was an Olympic for extreme parenting, we would both get gold. So thank you so much for sharing this conversation with me in such a caring, kind way to the families that are joining us today. And I know that they'll leave with some strategies and hopefully a little more compassion for themselves as they find their way to have that for their children too. Thank you to you both again. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Wishing you some ease as you find ways to connect with your kids when it feels impossible. Take care.